All right, so I am Matthew Continetti of the Wall Street Journal and the American Enterprise Institute, and I have the challenge of touring the world in 30 minutes with the United States Senator. So we'll see how much we can get in. But first, Senator McCormick, I thought we might begin with some of the headlines. The previous panel discussed the new national security strategy from the administration. I was wondering what your top-line thoughts were on the document.
Well, I think first of all, it's great to be here. Good to see lots of friends in the audience. Thanks, Matt, for doing this. I think if you go back to the 2017 National Security Strategy, which H.R. McMaster had led the charge on, and my wife had been part of that as his deputy, I think there's a lot of continuity from that to this in at least two ways. First, it's a recognition of key threats around the world. And the fact that economic security is national, and the emphasis on that, which I think is very important, that flows through. And I think the second principle is that our role in the world, our leadership in the world, depends most on what we do. It's mostly in our hands, but what's required is technological leadership, the kinds of policies at home that are going to ensure America's economic, technological, and national security strength. So I think those principles go through the document, and for me, that notion of our future depends much more on what we do than what our potential adversaries do is a really critical point. So that's I guess the first set of reflections. I think if you look at the different emphasis on regional threats, I see a much added threat on the Americas. On the risk posed here. I feel that very personally with what's happening in Pennsylvania with the fentanyl crisis. And 4,000 Pennsylvanians died last year, 100,000 Americans died this year. So I think that emphasis, I don't disagree with that emphasis. I think the national security strategy is probably more sanguine on the threat posed by China than I am. It lays out this hope of mutually advantageous economic relationships. I mean, you could have seen that in a document 20 years ago. And I think the last 20 years has given me, at least, a much more cautious approach. Certainly, we have to find ways to engage with China, but I do that with a deep-seated skepticism. So I'm less optimistic, probably, than the strategy on that. And I'm probably a little more optimistic on the prospects for Europe as a key ally. And by that, I mean, I think the critique of Europe is well-founded. Europe's been a basket case in terms of its economic policies, its immigration policies, which I think puts Europe at risk. But I also think that we have a shared value system that offers lots of opportunities for collaboration. And on a recent trip, I went to Estonia and Denmark, Finland, and Norway in August. I think you see lots of emergent recognition of the dramatic shift that needs to take place in Europe for Europe to be competitive, for Europe to prosper, and for Europe to be an ally of the United States. And you see the recognition of that with the funding towards NATO. You see that in at least a recognition that they're not competitive in these key technologies and need to do more, much more of a tough-minded approach to immigration. So I guess that would be my tour of the world. I see continuity. There's some things I would be very much in line with, some others that I have probably a different view.
I want to stay in the Western Hemisphere for a second because that's also current in the news. You have a personal connection to Latin America. I learned just this week that you were part of the operation against Manuel Noriega back in 1989.
Not quite, okay. Not quite. No, my unit was, the 82nd was, there's 3 brigades in the 82nd. 1 brigade went, and my brigade, I literally remember sitting on the runway in an airplane prepared to go, and the 1st brigade went, and the 2nd didn't. But I did make that reference in the context of this. So there's lots of people that I admire who disagree with what I'm about to say. But just to put it in context, first, I campaigned on this issue. I mean, I just want to, for those of you that have studied what's happening in the drug war and with fentanyl, I mean, when you go to the communities across Pennsylvania, it has ravaged. Pennsylvania ravaged the country. The numbers are staggering. 100,000 Americans last year. For those of you who know a lot about Vietnam, we lost about 53,000 in Vietnam in 8 years. 100,000 people last year, largely from opioids and fentanyl. So the scale and the scope of this problem, I think, requires a dramatic recognition of how severe it is and what's required. And that doesn't even begin to capture the cost and the addiction and everything. It didn't lead to 100,000 deaths. And so during the campaign, I saw this. I met with fentanyl families. It's a poison. It's highly concentrated. Most people that die from it, most kids don't even know they're ingesting it. And I made the point that, listen, we, number one, need to stop the flow of fentanyl across our borders. It mostly comes through Mexico, but it also comes through other places. Second, we need to designate the cartels as terrorist organizations. And the thinking behind that is these are quasi-military organizations. The kind of weaponry, the kind of sophistication they use in promoting the drug trade is enormous. And I said during the campaign that I thought we should, as we have in the past, thoughtfully deploy our military in pursuit of that mission. And there's lots of precedent for it in different ways. I used the Noriega example as a place where we deployed American forces, at least partially in a justification for that. Steve might have even been in government at the time when that happened. And there's lots of other examples that I think are consistent with that. So I made the case before I ever was elected that we should use our military selectively, and I think that's largely what's happening.
Is there anything that you would do differently than what the administration is pursuing at the moment? I mean, we just got the word of seizing the vessel from Venezuela. It seems like there's a gradual ratcheting up of power. Is it in your view that there's a strategy at work here or a definite endpoint?
I'm not sure entirely all the elements of the strategy, to be honest with you, but I do think efforts to, in a very strategic way, with high confidence driven by our intel, that you're targeting those narco-terrorist organizations and the infrastructure that supports them, I think that's warranted. And that's my understanding of what's happening. And I had the chance to talk to the chairman about this very recently with my own questions about it. And I came away with a high degree of confidence that that he believed and that our military was deploying our military resources in a way that met the threshold that we would all expect.
And just turning to China, maybe the way to get into this discussion is to talk about the AI race. You've spent a lot of time thinking about the issue of artificial intelligence. It's come up in discussions of the NDAA and the White House's desire to not allow any state-based regulations of AI. How do you come to this issue? What's your current thinking on it?
I sort of came into it from a local perspective, moving outward. But let me start outward and move back to Pennsylvania. I think what you think this is, I think, will lead you to how one thinks we should deal with it. If you think, as I do, that this is probably the biggest, not probably, highly likely that this is the most significant transformative thing to happen in our lifetimes, that being the emergence of AI, what it potentially means for national security, economic, cultural, the change that's coming about as part of this. Think the Industrial Revolution on steroids. If you believe that's what this is, which I believe, then one has to think about it in a certain way. And if you believe that this has the power, and is already doing this, in my opinion, to change how we think about disease, life sciences, nuclear power, advanced manufacturing, really fundamentally retool. Think about those of us that all live through the internet. This has profound implications that goes well beyond that. So if you think it's transformative in ways that we probably can't even fully imagine, and you think it has unbelievable benefits to society, but also poses enormous risk to those who are in a leadership position. We just had a hearing on Senate Foreign Relations today about the nuclear threat, proliferation, what AI might mean for how we should think about our nuclear force, how the Russians and Chinese are thinking. If you believe that this is transformative, then one has to plan to lead. One has to plan to be able to be the beneficiary of it and counter the threats. So that's my starting point. And if you think about what it takes for AI leadership, it takes enormous technological prowess to stay on the forefront. We'll come back to what that requires. And it takes enormous energy resources. So AI leadership and the AI transformation and the energy revolution, they are part of the same thing. They're different sides of the same coin. So if you get to that logic tree, then you say, wow, we have an enormous amount of work to do in ensuring we maintain that technological leadership, making sure that we have the smartest minds in the world that are focused here, making sure we have an ecosystem from a regulatory perspective that allows that AI to prosper, that AI industry to prosper with the appropriate guidelines. And we have to do the same thing on energy, which largely means permitting reform and so forth. That's how I get to the thing. And then I say, okay, I'm the senator from Pennsylvania. This thing's happening. You know, when I'm running around Pennsylvania, people say, how do we, this AI thing, should we be part of it or not be part of it? Man, you're part of it. It's coming. The question is, do you want to lead or do you want to be the tail of the dog that is wagged by what's happening? And the case that I've been making in Pennsylvania is we want to lead. We have to lead, and we're uniquely positioned to lead because leadership requires that technological prowess, Carnegie Mellon, places like that are going to have the science and the ability to push forward, but it also requires energy dominance. So we have the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world. We're the 2nd largest energy producer. It also requires, and here's the great irony, it also requires a lot of skilled talent. So at least in Pennsylvania, this revolution for the foreseeable future means more jobs, not less, for welders and pipe fitters and steam fitters and electricians. So there's a big boost at the same time that AI threatens people that maybe are lawyers or have journalists or have a certain set of things that are easily replicated by AI. So when I said earlier that our ability to sort of lead in our competition with our greatest adversary, China, depends on more on what we do, this is what I was talking about. It's creating an environment where we can lead on energy and artificial intelligence, be the place that all the talent in the world wants to come, have a regulatory framework that both protects on the guardrails but isn't so restrictive that it stalls innovation. And we've learned in the past that when we engage, when the government engages, it's more likely to get it wrong than right. So we should be humble in terms of our capacity and how we think about regulation. And so that's the battle we're in. And I like to say Pennsylvania is the point of the spear. We should be and can be in the lead. But then I say to my friends in Pennsylvania, including the governor, who is a Democrat, I say, listen, I've seen this. I've been in business for 30 years. We're in this existential battle with China for leadership. But in Pennsylvania, we're also competing against Georgia and Florida and Texas. And capital and talent, they're like water. They go down the path of least resistance. So we better think about what it's going to take to be the leaders and attract the capital and attract the investment. And I'll say one more thing. So with that in mind, think, okay, you're the new senator from Pennsylvania. What do you do? Well, the thing that hadn't been done, which was a surprise to us, and this was my wife's idea, was to bring together the leaders in energy, technology, and investing all in one room at the CEO level. Get the President of the United States and his cabinet, get the governor of Pennsylvania, who's a Democrat, get the other senator from Pennsylvania, because, by the way, AI doesn't end with the Democratic AI or the Republican AI. This is just what's required to lead, and get them in a room together and say, what are we going to do to make sure Pennsylvania and America leads? And then the secondary question was, well, if we're going to lead, and we've been talking about all these things, why don't we actually make something happen now? So what investments are you all willing to make? You've been talking about how do we use this as a catalyst for investment? And 3 things happened. $92 billion of investment in Pennsylvania were committed on that day. Kind of unprecedented. Never happened in Pennsylvania, or really I can't think of a situation in the country where that's ever happened, where the leaders have come together one day, $92 billion. 150 media outlets came together to talk about it so we could blast Pennsylvania's story to the country and to the world. By the way, at that summit, we had the head of Mubadala, one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world from the Middle East, the head of GIC, the biggest sovereign wealth from Asia, and we had the head of the Canadian Pension Plan, one of the biggest pools of capital from Canada, all talking about how Pennsylvania and America can lead. And then we had the jobs that were created. Oh, by the way, the unions were there. The building trades were there, right? Talking about how they can really capture the opportunity coming from here and all the workforce challenges that it creates. So I think, not to make too much of that, but I think it's going to take that kind of thinking. And I think the worst risk we have is a fear of failure, because we're going to fail on the way to winning. I always say to the kids, failing is the thing that happens right before you succeed. And then the second thing we're going to need to do is not think incrementally. Incrementalism in this moment will kill us because the stakes are so high, the change so quickly, things are changing so quickly that that we're going to have to make big bets and learn from them.
If there is one thing you think the United States needs to do to maintain our edge in AI and compute over the coming years, say, what is it?
Well, I'd say two. I said capital and talent. On the capital side, capital is stalled by the pace at which you can get permits to create energy infrastructure. It is an absolute killer. If you're a capital allocator, people in this room that have run businesses or run investment firms, the worst thing is uncertainty. You're not gonna lean into capital allocation when you're uncertain about whether some person in the bowels of the Department of the Economy or Economics in Pennsylvania or some local township or at the federal government is going to stand in the way of investment, because the return, if you're waiting for 3 years where you could go somewhere else, it's just not worth it. So permitting reform, and by the way, the permitting reform is for all forms of energy. Wherever you are on this of alternative fuels, right? It's wind, it's solar, it's nuclear, it's natural gas, it's permitting, it's nuclear, it's across the board. Permitting reform. By some estimates, there's more than $1 trillion of capital waiting to be allocated to energy, and the people that come to see me say, hey, we're just worried about permitting reform. So that's a big issue. The president's done a lot with executive orders, but the Congress needs to move forward on comprehensive permitting reform. That's one thing. Second thing, I don't think we should take for granted. I think we still are the place that the brightest minds in the world want to come. This is a talent game. We have, 300 million people, and the world has 8 billion people, so it's be a little presumptuous to think all the smart ones are here. So we need to continue to be the place that the talent wants to come, and that's not inconsistent with secure borders and being tough on illegal immigration. But we need to be the place that people continue to come. We need to navigate and mitigate the security risk associated with that. That's not an easy question, but we need to make sure that our universities and our technologists are the best in the world. And that history of that has always proven to be one of America's greatest assets.
What was your reaction to the administration's decision to allow the sale of the NVIDIA chips, the A200 chips, this week?
I'm concerned. I'm not clear on why that is the right path for us. I want to be convinced because I keep asking the question. The argument is, as I understand it, and I think Jensen's done a remarkable job, and I've talked to him about this a number of times. The argument is that this will somehow slow China's capacity to develop its own capability by giving them the most advanced chips. I don't think that's been the experience. I think you can count on China to be doing everything in its power to develop its own independent capacity, and that America's position should be, in my opinion, doing everything we can to maintain a lead. So it appears to me that by exporting those chips, it's not, let me say it this way, it's not clear to me how that would in any way slow their advances, and it seems more likely that it would accelerate them. So for that reason, I've joined two pieces as an original co-sponsor, two pieces of legislation, the GAIN AI Act with Senator Banks and Senator Warren, and the Safe Chips Act with Senator Ricketts and Senator Coons, both of which put brakes on that. And so I'm interested in hearing more, but at this point, I don't see the case, and I'm certainly see the need to maintain leadership, and I want to do everything I can to make sure America remains at the forefront of this important battle.
You mentioned your trip to Eastern Europe a little bit earlier in the conversation. When you got back, what did you tell your friends in the administration about what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong in order to bring the Ukraine war to an end? What should they be doing?
Well, my biggest takeaway from that, I mean, that your question is a really complicated question, which I'll try to hit. But the big takeaway, which I think is even more important than the answer to your question from my perspective, is what's occurring on the ground there is truly a revolution in military affairs. All of us that have been in this business for a while, we've seen these moments where these discontinuities, where the way warfare is waged has changed dramatically. throughout history, we've mostly been playing catch up on those. We mostly missed it and then tried to catch up. And what's happening now on the ground in Ukraine with drones, drone swarms, robotics, autonomy, integrated with, 155 rounds that are 80 years old from, that kind of technology and artillery is truly unprecedented. And of course, the question, and I don't, I'm not in the middle of this, but the question, of course, our leaders should be asking is, are we doing everything we can to extract those lessons, extract the data, and make sure we are jumping ahead of what's to come? Because the lessons there are the lessons that are certainly being incorporated by the Russians, by the Iranians, by the Chinese, in terms of how they think about war. Listen, I think on the broader conflict, President Trump laid out a vision for what a resolution to this would look like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, which seemed completely sensible to me. And it had 3 or 4 components. It essentially said, which everybody has some degree of discomfort with, which is the nature of such agreements, right? So you're never going to get the answer everybody says, that's awesome. But what he laid out was, number one, we're going to have a ceasefire, stop the killing, something close to the line of demarcation where the current lines are. That was the first thing. Second thing he said is there's got to be a security arrangement, security agreement, largely led by the Europeans that would give Ukraine confidence in its future sovereignty. In other words, whatever the end of this would be, it couldn't be a 2-year hiatus where the Russians could rearm themselves and come back. So it had to create some permanent security guarantee and support, largely led by the Europeans. The Europeans had to own that burden, but America would support that with intelligence, with equipment, and not with boots on the ground. That seems sensible to me. And then the third piece of it was there should be an economic component, which there's lots of rare earth metals, all sorts of capability in Ukraine that needed to be developed. America would be partially the beneficiary of that. Ukraine would be the beneficiary of that. But the key part of it was that would not only help pay back what had been committed, but also give America reinforcement of the value of what it's doing there. But it would, most importantly, be a deterrent to Russia. It would create an economic arrangement that would make it more difficult for Russia to come back later. That framework made sense to me. The ongoing discussions are hard to follow from where I am in terms of how close we are to that mark. But if we got to something like that, I think it would be a real success.
Lastly, on the world scene, Middle East, Gaza, will there be a stage 2 to the ceasefire?
You can't go into that without saying from where we were to where we are is truly remarkable. I mean, again, for people in this room that have been following these issues, I wouldn't have imagined it. I was in Israel not 60 days after October 7th, saw what happened there, the horrificness of that. We sort of suffered 2 wars on that day, 2 surprise attacks, one from Hamas, and then what happened here in the United States and the rise of anti-Semitism, which was, at least for me as a non-Jewish person who always knew that anti-Semitism lurked beneath the surface, would have never imagined it would rear its head the way it did. So it was a shocking set of circumstances that happened. And here we are several years later, the hostages are released. Iran's nuclear capability, even under the most pessimistic assessments, has been set back quite significantly. Israel did a remarkable job of taking that mission on, but America stood with Israel and came in and delivered a military capability to get to the bunker with bunker busters that the Israelis would not have otherwise. The absolute systematic eradication of the leadership of Hezbollah, the systematic elimination of much of Hamas, hostages home, unfortunately those who lost their lives, their bodies home. I mean, by any measure, a shocking success for people who have been following this region forever. And so I wouldn't bet against them. I wouldn't bet against them on phase 2. I mean, I think the groundwork's been laid. I think President has unique credibility with the Gulf states and unique credibility with Israel. That's the starting point. Unique credibility and trust. The incentives are aligned. You got bad actors. It's always going to be messy. There's no straight lines in life. It's going to be bumpy. You're going to have setbacks. But I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic.
My very last question, I have to know, what's it like to go to a wrestling match with President Trump?
That was, well, it was not only President Trump, but Elon Musk. So I had invited, wrestling's a big deal in Pennsylvania, big deal. And during the campaign, I had wrestled in high school and college. So I ran a lot of commercials about wrestling, and it was sort of a big part of it. And the wrestlers came out in waves for me, and they're also very supportive of President Trump. So when he called me not long after I'd won the race, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And I said two things. I said, "I want to do a big summit about energy and AI, and I want to have you come to the National Wrestling Championships in Philadelphia." And I said that without thinking much. And then he agreed, and I said, "Wait, it's Philadelphia." And Philadelphia is inner city Philadelphia. It's very, very Democrat, and of course President Trump's a Republican, so I wasn't sure his popularity there. But this is the city where they throw snowballs at Santa Claus at the Eagles games. So you're a little worried about it. But he went in and got a great reception, and this wrestling match went on and on. And so President Trump and I were talking, and I was losing like things to talk about, trying to explain what was going on. I said, "Dina, why don't we switch?" And she said, "I've been talking to Elon. I'm out of things to talk about too." So I thought he was going to leave, and I said, "Mr. President, it's time for you to go." He goes, "No, I'm staying," because the wrestlers were coming over and doing selfies. So he liked it, and he was really getting into it. And so we waited till the end, and it was the last match, and this was like the underdog match. This was like Rocky many times over. So it was the Olympic gold medalist wrestling a guy from the Air Force who was like not even ranked in the country. And one of the biggest upsets in collegiate history, this Air Force guy who runs out with a flag on, by the way. I mean, this guy knew how to play the crowd, runs out with a flag wrapped around him, beats the Olympic gold medalist, and stands up and salutes. The crowd goes wild. President Trump said, "It's the best sporting event I've ever seen in my life." And I said, "Thank God." And so it was a big day in Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you very much, Senator McCormick, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.